So, I was going to start out this video making a joke about how this channel was a big Nintendo 64 fanboy channel, and then be like, psych, and then proceed to talk trash about the Nintendo 64. But the more I wrote, the more it just seemed mean-spirited, so I decided to axe it. I mean, I'm here legitimately doing videos about games that appeared on the 32X. What room do I have to talk trash about Nintendo 64 fans? We all like what we like, and that's one of the things that makes video games great. Whether you're talking about current day titles or retro games, like the subject of this channel. For instance, I'm not the biggest strategy game fan, but that doesn't make them bad necessarily, and maybe you like them, and have lots of fun with them. It's really cool that there's that much diversity out there, and like I encourage at the end of each one of these reviews, whatever you like to play, definitely have fun. Unless it's a Nintendo 64 game, then just get help, please. Okay, enough silliness aside, let's get into this. If you're not aware, this is the Zilog and Moto channel where your host, me, picks a game each and every week for either the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, or 32X. Or both, I guess. And goes in depth into the title, looking at its history, links to other titles, the actual package of the game, and then if it's any good or not, which, I'll be honest, has not always gone the way I've expected it to over the past 124 episodes. Also, I've still got another 1,150 games to go to make it through the entire English language library for those consoles, so pull up a chair, click subscribe, and get some snacks, because I'm going to be here doing these reviews for a while. Now, on to this week's game. The New Zealand Story for the Master System. The New Zealand Story is a port of the arcade game from Taito, which was released in the arcades in mid-1988. If you're an American, you'd be excused for not being familiar with this title. I don't think I've ever seen the arcade version, except for maybe walking past it at Galloping Ghost, and it was never released for a console or home computer in the United States. Well, except for the NES version, which for some inexplicable reason was renamed Kiwi Craze, and even that version is rated as uncommon in Pat Contry's Guide to the NES Library. And honestly, it might be rarer than that, because I had a hell of a time trying to find the artwork for this. For whatever reason, the game has more of a following in Europe, where it appeared on the usual suspects of 8 and 16-bit home computers in 1989, before coming out of nowhere to pop up on the Master System in November of 1992. What is the New Zealand Story? Well, the best way to describe the game is it's an action platformer, where you take on the role of Tiki the Kiwi, who has to rescue his friends from Wally Walrus, who had Robotnikized a bunch of Kiwi's friends at the beginning of the game. This rescue mission takes Tiki through 21 levels in 5 different locations all across New Zealand, culminating in that final showdown with Wally. And just to be clear, Tiki the Kiwi is a flightless bird originating from New Zealand and not a ditzy stripper from Auckland, although I could understand how you might confuse the two. So, how is the New Zealand Story on the Master System? Does it compare well to the original arcade machine? And how does it look compared to its 8-bit brethren on the NES? Well, I'll look into all that and more, but first, a look at that European package. And here's the Master System version of the New Zealand Story, and this copy's in decent shape. The clamshell's in really nice condition, no tears or holes to the outer plastic, and it's not all scratched up, but the hang tab has been removed from the top of the case. Unfortunately, even though the actual case is held up well, it looks like that the inner cover has taken some water damage to the bottom, and if you look close you can see some edge wear and some slight discoloration in the middle of the front and the back. But thankfully that's minor, and you've got to be looking real close to see it. Finally, if you look at the opening of the case, you'll see a Sega seal sticker folded over, and I probably would just skip this normally, but it came up on Twitter this week, so I felt like mentioning it. If you're just an American collector, you've probably never seen this sticker, as I've only ever seen it on European editions. I've guessed in the past that perhaps this was done to avoid shrink-wrapping titles and still having them sealed, but I don't know. Maybe if someone from the PAL region sees this and knows the actual reason Sega used these stickers in Europe, you can comment and enlighten us all. Moving on to the front cover, a few things I want to point out. The first is the cover art. TechMagic went with a slightly different style of art for the cover than what was used on the other editions of the game. And I don't mind it, it's still very colorful and does a good job of representing the game, but I definitely prefer the covers that the other European versions got, as they're closer to what the game actually looks like, and there's just something really appealing about that style. Also, something that was always a little confusing about the game to me, going back to when I would see it advertised in gaming magazines back in the 90s, is the title logo, which has New Zealand all mashed up into one word, as opposed to being two separate words. I wonder if that was just a translation error that never got fixed. I don't know. And it's not that it's just that particular logo that's odd. If you flip over to the spine, you can see it all run together there as well. Flipping over to the back, and holy microscopic font, Batman! Even for a European release, this is a bit extreme because it appears that they were trying to fit flavor text back here for not 6, not 7, but 8 different languages. I get that they were trying to release a product to appeal to as much of Europe as possible, but this is borderline unreadable unless you get right up in it. The actual flavor text, if you can read 6-point font, is fine and does a good job of selling the game. However, one of the reasons the font was so small was that they could include 4 screenshots on the back, which normally I would approve of, but these screenshots aren't very good quality, for 1992 especially, and if that was the best they could do, they probably should have dropped one of them and maybe some of this art that's duplicated from the front, giving them more room to actually go to, 8-point font. Finally, this squashing everything down results in this hilariously small stats box that the Master System games always has, and sure, these aren't always the same size, but this is ridiculous. Opening the case up, and this is one of those later third-party Master System releases that forgoes the traditional red or blue labels and is white. I've seen this with a few games so far, for instance Gauntlet, and I get the why, but it just still seems weird to me. The manual is the traditional landscape mode format that was used with European releases to accommodate the multiple languages, and I'd honestly expect bigger to cover 8, but the reason for this is that there's only 3 pages per language. But even with those 3 pages, due to the small font, the game is at least explained fully. Although I'm crying foul, pun fully intended, about this controller handling section, which tells you to use a reverse thumb grip when playing the game, and that's wildly unnecessary. Finally, at the end, they included ads for 4 other TechMagic releases, where they use review scores to sell the games, and seriously? 5 magazines gave Pac-Mania over 90%? That's just... wow. Okay, enough about all that. Let's get to the review and see what the New Zealand story is all about. As I mentioned previously, the original arcade version of the New Zealand story was created by Taito, and the reason why I bring this up is because when I first played the Master System version, I immediately felt tinges of Bubble Bobble, one of their most well-known games. Now, I'm certainly not comparing the two games directly, as they are definitely not the same, with Bubble Bobble consisting of single-screen levels, and the New Zealand story having a more standard side-scrolling platformer setup. And the further you go in the game, the levels begin to get increasingly large, and actually referred to as mazes, due to Tiki needing to go up, down, left, and right to get to the end of the level. This is definitely not a basic left-to-right side-scroller to be sure, but something about the art style and how the characters move, especially with Tiki only being able to jump to a certain height, and then have to ride balloons if he wants to fly, much like the dragons Bub and Bob, definitely bring back some of those memories. And in fact, even though it didn't make the Master System version, the arcade version and some of the other ports of the game feature the Extend system from Bubble Bobble, where you can collect the letters E, X, T, E, N, and D that are hidden in parts of the levels that you might not normally visit to get a bonus. Having said that, this is probably a good time to discuss just how close a port from the arcade version this Master System version is. And the short version is, I think it's a very solid port, especially considering we're talking about a port to an 8-bit system. While there's some details missing from the Master System version, especially in regards to the backgrounds, the game remains very colorful and it still largely resembles the arcade version. In contrast, the other 8-bit console version on the NES looks washed out and features less detail on the sprites and backgrounds. So, yet again, like we saw previously with Gauntlet Rampage, the Master System wins the battle of the arcade ports. Granted, like with those two titles, the Master System version came out years after the NES version, but I'm not sure a few extra years would have helped the color situation on that console. While it would have been nice to have the Extend system retained from the arcade, there's actually a different feature that's missing that, if I had a choice, would have made the transition, and that's the minimap system. Maybe mini-map system isn't the correct term, but in the arcade version, in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, there's a transparent box that represents the level and shows where you are versus where the level exit is. And that's something that would be very useful, especially in the larger levels that have increasingly maze-like characteristics. I don't think this feature made any of the home ports, including the more powerful 16-bit versions, so at least the Master System is in good company in that regard. The Master System also compares nicely with the Mega Drive version, but there's a pretty big caveat there. Not only was the Mega Drive version released 2.5 years before the Master System version exclusively in Japan, but it also was apparently based on a prototype version of the arcade game, and as a result, it has a very different level structure and look. And in fact, I wasn't originally planning on picking up and reviewing the Mega Drive version due to it being a Japanese release, but with it basically being a different game, I think that's interesting enough to take a closer look at, so maybe I'll be putting that on the schedule in a future video. And all that was a very long way of saying that if you want to play an authentic port of the New Zealand story on a Sega platform, you're going to want to go with the Master System version over the Mega Drive, something that I certainly wouldn't have predicted. One final technical detail before getting into the game itself: since this is a European release, that means that if you're playing on original hardware, the question of whether to play the game in PAL 50Hz or NTSC 60Hz comes up. I had originally been playing the game in NTSC, as is the norm for my Master System games, and it seemed technically fine, so I didn't think anything of it, but the creator of the YouTube channel Dudley of Yesterzine just happened to mention that I should run it in PAL mode, and I can confirm that it does feel better this way. So thanks to Dudley for that, and I'll be linking their channel below. It's got a very interesting concept that I think you'll enjoy. Okay, now to get more in depth with the game itself, I mentioned previously that the New Zealand story is an action platformer with one button for shooting and one button for jumping. As you go through the level and defeat enemies, they'll either drop fruit, which can be collected for points, different weapons, and various power-ups. But you have to be quick, as they'll disappear from the screen after a few seconds. This actually creates an interesting dynamic. Do you choose to get the item, or if it's not directly in your path, maybe skip it as to not risk getting hit? But you have to make that choice very quickly, as otherwise it won't be there for you to grab. Also, there can be some strategy to when you pick up weapon power-ups as well, as each weapon works a little differently. For instance, even though it's technically more powerful than the bow and arrow you start out with, I try to never grab the bombs, as they have a much shorter range and they can be very frustrating to use when you're up against enemies that can fire all the way across the screen. There's other non-weapon power-ups to grab also, like the clock to stop all the enemies in their tracks, and the joystick, which might not be the most valuable power-up, but it's probably the most convenient, as it allows you to pilot balloons without having to hold down on the jump button. Riding around on balloons might not be the first thing you think of about in a platformer, but it's absolutely integral to the design of this game. Taito smartly decided that if they're going to design a game around a kiwi, that it wouldn't be able to fly, since that's one of the main things about kiwis. They're one of the few flightless birds in the world. But then some software designer, who was probably overworked and in desperate need of sleep, thought, but what if they could? This flying mechanic really opens up the possibilities of the game and allows the levels to be much more complex than in a traditional platform of the time. Keep in mind the arcade version was designed back when the Super Mario Bros. Series was still a primarily left-to-right affair. Also, I like how the designers weren't satisfied with just one type of balloon to ride on. Oh no, there's 6, each working slightly differently. I especially enjoy the one that's shaped like a goose. It just seems funny to me. And of course, having multiple different balloons opens up the varieties of enemies that you'll encounter, and that's something that I appreciate as well. This isn't a game where you're going to be fighting just the same 3 or 4 enemies the entire game. I really enjoy a lot about the design of the New Zealand story. I like the art style used with the characters. It's cute and unique, and something that could really appeal to children. I also like the design of the levels, with them starting out simple and becoming much more complex as you advance in the game. But beyond the complexity, they're all very different, even though the levels in the same area have the same basic look. And I like the weapon system and all the various power-ups that are available. They could have gone simpler, but smartly did not. However, there's one major problem with the game, and for most, it's something that's probably going to drive people away. That one issue is the difficulty. Holy crap. You see, this is definitely a game that was originally designed to be a quarter muncher in part. You start out the game with 3 lives, and you can gain more if you can score enough points, somewhat as you might expect in an arcade title. However, Tiki, being a small, cute kiwi bird, has no life bar. You get hit in the New Zealand story, you die. Simple as that. And between plenty of enemies in the levels, both ground-based and flying, and all the spikes that are in the levels, you will get hit and you will die. The designers were merciful enough to restart you in a level exactly where you were when you died, so that's nice. But even with that, those 3 lives are going to go quickly. In the arcades, you could simply put more quarters to continue, but in the Master System version, the best you can hope to do is earn 2 continues by getting past 2 specific levels in the game. This just silly level of difficulty is part of why I included the anecdote about playing the game in PAL mode, because it is slower than NTSC, which does make the game easier to a degree, but don't expect it to be a magic bullet, because it is still very hard. From a graphics perspective, I've already mentioned that I like the design of the game, just something about the way it looks is very appealing. I like a lot of the small details in the backgrounds, like in the first area, all the different signs indicating the zoo and silhouettes of other animals. The character animations are minimal, and the sprites are relatively small, but that's to be expected with a game originating in 1988. I think my one big beef with the graphics is just a general issue that the Master System has, and that's with flickering when there are too many sprites on one line. This is something that will definitely happen from time to time in the game, and it's made worse if you choose to use a rapid-fire controller, as the console simply can't handle all the action. For the most part, it's just an annoyance rather than anything else, but there are times when enemies are shooting at you rather than you just shooting at them, and you'll end up dying because you got hit by an invisible projectile due to the flickering. Just another way the game's difficulty can kick you in the balls. Unfortunately, I don't appreciate the sound in the game as much as the graphics. It's fine, don't get me wrong, and it fits the cute nature of the game, but the background music largely consists of the same song over and over again. It's a good song, and I like the instrumentation, but anything repeated that much is going to become tiresome after a while. The one caveat I'll say to that is that the arcade version music is the same way, so I suppose I can't fault Tech-Magic too much for that. The sound effects are fairly basic as well, and you do get a few different ones, say depending on what weapon you're using, but it's clear that this is one of those titles where more effort was put into the graphics than the music. Overall, there's something intrinsic about the New Zealand story that I really like. It's just a very enjoyable concept for a platformer, and I like how its weapons are almost Contra-esque. I mean, there's a lot of shooting going on in an otherwise cutesy game. The difficulty is just a bummer though, and that's why all the footage you're seeing is from the first 6 levels, because that was as far as I could get. I'm sure with some practice I could probably hit that first continue and make it into the 3rd area, but beyond that, I don't know. It definitely makes me want to go back later and maybe use some sort of cheat to see the whole game. But as is, I simply can't give it more than 2 stars. Had the difficulty been less punishing, this would have been an easy 3-star game, and even though I do like it, I can't recommend it to anyone besides those that like really difficult games, or people that just love platformers. Okay, that was the New Zealand story, specifically for the Master System. Sometimes when you like a game, you can still be disappointed in it. And don't get me wrong, I totally understand that there are those out there that really appreciate 8-bit hard or Dark Souls type games, and really enjoy that level of challenge. But for me, at this point in my life, I've got better things to do than bang my head against the same 4 levels over and over again, just for the chance at possibly getting slightly further, and knowing that the end is still very far off. However, if you do want a challenge, this is at least a good title to waste your time with, rather than just some frustrating mess with bad controls. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's sequel time, but it's not a sports sequel. And more interestingly, to me, it's a sequel that I've never played, even though I was very familiar with the original game. In fact, this is one of those later releases on the Genesis that either I didn't know existed, or just that knowledge got lost to time, until I started this collection, and I finally picked it up just a few months ago, specifically because I knew I had this slot coming on the schedule. You could say that I'm anxious to play this next game. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, like I said earlier, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!